How can you raise an exception in Python? Python's square root function in the math module raises an exception when it's given a negative number. So when we pass a negative number to isPrime will pass it into the square root function, which raises a value error exception. Now, there are probably some cases that isPrime should be raising an exception that it isn't right now. For example, if we pass a floating point number to isPrime, it returns an answer, sometimes a really weird answer. It probably should be raising an exception because it doesn't make sense to ask a non-integer whether it's prime. Also, if we pass in 0 or 1 to isPrime, it tells us true. It should probably either tell us false or raise an exception. So we could modify our isPrime function to check for these two conditions, raising an exception if those conditions are met. We'll ask whether the given number is an instance of the float class, and if it is, we'll raise a type error exception using Python's raise statement, passing in a type error exception object. Now, we're using a type error because the wrong type was given. And if the number given is less than 2, we'll say that this isn't a valid value, so we'll raise a value error exception. We'll say that only integers above 1 are accepted. And in both of these cases, the error message that's going to be printed out to the screen, going to be shown to the screen when our traceback is shown, shows the number that was given to make our error message as helpful as possible when we're debugging our code. So now when we call isPrime with a floating point number, it shows a type error exception. A type error that says only integers are accepted. And if we call isPrime with 1 or 0, it gives us a value error exception. Now, where did type error and value error come from? We didn't define those classes, so they must be defined in Python. If you look at help on the built-ins module in Python, or if you look at the documentation for exceptions, you'll see the exception hierarchy. There are dozens of exceptions built into Python. We don't have to import anything in order to use these exceptions. They're just built in. So type error and value error are just two of the built-in exceptions. We can define our own custom exception types by inheriting from exception, but it's a little bit unusual to do so. You don't usually do that unless you really need to distinguish your exceptions from exceptions that are built into Python. Usually, when I'm raising an exception, the most common exception type I raise is a value error. If you have a specific condition in your function in Python that should loudly crash your program if that condition is met, you can raise an exception using the raise statement in Python, giving it an exception object. You can make an exception object by calling an exception class, giving it a helpful error message.